This is Aron Ra, and this is Vinsoriality.
I'm Vin.
I'm Sori.
And I'm Aron.
So going back to Jesus, you seem to have a very big problem with Jesus. So let me say it from my perspective, and then
I actually have a lot of problems with Jesus. We could do a whole show just on my problem with Jesus.
Which I thought to myself, okay, this guy, that at least we have something to work with here. Mm-hmm. Because I'm not really a fan of the whole I hate Christianity, but Jesus is awesome. Like, I'm not really. He's the founder, so what the hell? Okay. Doesn't make sense. I don't really like that Nazi stuff, but that Hitler, he was a stand-up guy. So let's say, for example, now let's presuppose something real quick. Let's say that Jesus had this world-changing message that was going to benefit humanity exponentially, but he knew that if he spoke that message, it would cause disruption in the family system of his current age, but would do good for humanity overall over time, over the next 10,000 years. Wouldn't that be a necessary sacrifice?
If he had a life-changing message, it was going to...
I knew you were going to go there, but I hate to interrupt you. Whether or not the message was positive or not, we can debate in a second. What I'm saying right now is, let's say that he has an objectively good, transformative message that's going to literally save the world, right?
Then why didn't he bring that message instead of the one he brought?
Okay, we can have that in a second. But the question I'm trying to ask you is, let's say we grant objectively, this is just a thought experiment. Okay. Let's say we grant objectively that Jesus had this awesome, great, life-changing message that was going to save the world, literally. But he knew that in his current generation, it was going to cause so much friction between family members that these things were going to happen. And he wanted his folks to read the fine print before they signed up, right? Okay,
so you're asking me to assume at the onset that everything I know is wrong to adopt that point. I'm not getting it.
That's why we have here's my point. My point is, you're saying that he was one of the reasons you have a problem with him is because he blew up the nuclear.
He did not have an objectively good message, not by any stretch of the imagination. Well, not at all.
The example that you brought up was that he blew up the nuclear family.
It wasn't just that. There's nothing good about the Christian message whatsoever.
Tell me what the Christian message is.
Okay. You have to ignore Isaiah 45, where God says that he's the only God and there is none that sits by me. Instead, go back to where Jesus said that he's on the right hand of the Father. Ignore that the Jewish God says there's no one here. Jesus says he's there. And God says in the very first commandment that, you will have no other gods before me. And then Jesus says the only way to get to the Father is through me. So being Christian automatically violates the very first commandment to begin with. That's the first problem.
Is that your argument?
No, I said that's the first problem.
That's not
So I'm building a pyramid of problems, and that's the first one.
Well, I heard you say that, and it actually surprised me that you said that. Because are you familiar with intertestamental Jewish binitarianism?
No.
The two powers in heaven? Okay, so you have this character in the Old Testament named the Malach Elohim, the angel of God or the angel of the Lord. And he is referred to as Yahweh multiple times throughout the Old Testament, even in the Torah. And so in the intertestamental period, the Jews were trying to figure out who is the second power, right? And so that's where Philo gets the term, when he developed this idea of logos. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you're familiar with Philo. And so there are all these candidates for who the second power was. What's interesting is after the inception of Christianity, Judaism basically outlawed that as a doctrine. But prior to the inception of Christianity, you were completely allowed to speculate on who the two powers in heaven were, because there were two distinct figures called Yahweh in the Old Testament, clearly. You can research this in the book, Two Powers in Heaven, actually. It's about Jewish binitarianism. So I'm surprised.
It's curious. I've never heard Jewish binitarianism before.
Yeah, I'm very, very surprised that you there are multiple passages in the Torah in the Old Testament. The famous one being Genesis 19, Judges chapter 1, Judges chapter 6, the famous one where Moses is talking to Yahweh in the burning bush. I'm sure you're familiar with that story. It's actually the angel of Yahweh who he's talking to, who reveals the tetragrammaton, the divine name, to Moses. So I remember that you were talking about how Jesus said, "I am" before Abraham, John 8:58. And you said that's not a claim to divinity. Of course,
it's a claim to divinity if Jesus is going to call himself immortal like unto God. But Jesus is always very clear that God is someone else, somewhere else, who knows things he doesn't know and can do things he can't do, which means that Jesus is not God. And people always want to say, well, Jesus said that he and God are one. I'm like, yeah. And then later Jesus has to ask God in prayer if his disciples can be one with God just like he is, which means that he isn't one like God, like they're saying he is. He is not an avatar of God. He's not God made flesh. He's a different person.
Well, hold on for a second. Because you made a statement about the deity of Jesus being a problem because of Isaiah 45. What I explained to you was that there is a whole tradition of theology within Judaism that predates Christianity. As a matter of fact, I don't want to say stole, but let's just say stole to be cheeky. John, in John in the beginning, that famous, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, John chapter 1. That term logos, the term for word is logos, which Philo was actually a contemporary of John. Philo had already developed the theology of the logos and basically hinted that the logos was the second power in heaven, sort of like a lowercase g divine being by which Yahweh, because he's so transcendent, one of the problems was, how does a completely transcendent being interact with the lesser world? And that's when they developed this idea of the second divine being, which you find all through the Old Testament. So the idea that Isaiah 45 is some problem for Christianity is not really true. That's not a problem at all.
Okay, but one of the problems that I have is that when we mentioned before about truth, and that you can't call it true unless you can verify that it is true, or you can't call it truth until you can show that it is true. The only value information can have is however true you can show it to be, or however accurate you can show it to be. And if you can't show that it is accurate at all, then it has no value at all.
I agree with that.
So when people want to make up a God and then they make up details about that God, they can make up all the other additional details they want. They can say that he's covered in chocolate frosting with sprinkles. It doesn't matter because there's not an ounce of truth to it.
Yeah. The problem, though, Aron, is that you made a statement that Isaiah 45 was this problem for Christianity.
It is a problem in interpretations of the Trinity, wherein Jesus is supposed to be God made flesh, that they are the same person. If that were the case...
No, that's not true.
Okay.
No, that's not a Trinitarian formula. The Trinitarian formula makes...
So you recognize how many Christians don't realize that there is a Yahweh character. They think Jesus is Yahweh. I mean, there's God the Son, and there's Jesus the Son, and Jesus the Father, and Jesus the Holy Ghost. They don't realize there's Yahweh and Jesus, and then this Holy Ghost character. I've talked to a lot...
You think Christians don't make the distinction between the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit?
I said many Christians. I'm not going to make it a blanket statement because I've met many who understand the Trinity and advocate that the Trinity is that God made Jesus as a flesh version of himself so that he, Yahweh, could come down to earth as Jesus, and so that Yahweh, the immortal, can die as Jesus. So Jesus is God's avatar in this video game, where God exists outside the game, but he can't exist in the game unless he's Jesus.
Well, that's not historical Christianity. I mean, we already had this discussion in the Council of Nicaea, right? What you're describing,
Arius and Arenatheus, which is Athanasius
versus Arius. But what you're describing is monarchianism, which is, when you said, I saw in one of your videos where you said, was Jesus talking to himself when he was in the garden? Obviously not. I mean, the Orthodox definition of the Trinity is that there's one being. And
so this came up in a conversation with Christians the other day on Twitter, but it never went to its logical conclusion. It just sort of dropped off, where I say that the guy says that there's one God in three persons. And he says God, not Yahweh. He said God and Jesus and the Holy Ghost. And I said, okay, so you've got God but it's God in three persons, but it's God and Jesus and the Holy Ghost. So God plus Jesus and the Holy Ghost equals God, or God minus Jesus and the Holy Ghost equals God.
No,
Without the Holy Ghost, without Jesus, God is still God. So it's God plus,
this is why when I have these conversations, I never have them on Twitter or Facebook. I usually say, give me your email address, and I have one of these video conversations. But we're talking
That's a much better way to do it, because you're not going to get anything sensible out of Twitter.
Well, that's probably why they dropped off. What you're talking, but the standard formulation is that there's one what and three whos. So, for example,
well, that would be like the Hindu Trimurti, but when I bring that up, well, then they balk. But that's the very kind of Trinity that you're talking about, where Shiva, Brahma, and Vishnu are all three different entities, but they're the same Godhead. And then the Christian that I'm arguing with doesn't know what a Godhead is.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's in their King James. So.
Yeah, but if I can jump off of this remote, because we're going to be bogged down in this. We originally mentioned, I said that Jesus didn't have an objectively positive message.
Yeah, so
it was buy my bullshit or you'll be damned, but pretty much the summary. So there's the stick and the carrot. There's pay my priest's tithe, buy my bullshit, treat me like I'm something special, and you'll get the threat of a fate worse than death if you don't. Where's the objective positive message in that?
Okay, so first of all, I don't think he said anything about pay any priest's tithe, because if he did, the priest wouldn't have been at the charge to kill him. I'm pretty sure he said, freely you were given, freely give, right?
Okay. And I'll grant that, because I realize that the way that early Christianity was taught is not remotely anything like modern prosperity gospel is now, where the eye of the needle has become wide enough to fly for an evangelical to fly his jet through.
His private jet. Okay, that's fair. And then on top of that, and there's one more thing I got to talk to you about before we leave, but on top of that, you have a guy that's saying, look, both of us agree that human beings have a high capacity for sucking, right? I mean, we already established that. Yeah. So what he said was, you guys have already made a mess of it, and I'm going to show you the way. And the ultimate demonstration of that is he preached nonviolence, to your point where you talked about don't resort to violence unless it's absolutely necessary.
Same guy that told his people to go sell your clothes and buy swords.
Are you serious? Is that a serious statement?
We are talking about the same guy.
We are. Do you remember the context of the passage?
Not offhand, no.
What was the reason Jesus gave for why he told them to sell your cloak and buy a sword?
I can't remember where the story was, and I want to say that it was right after the Gethsemane thing, but I don't think that's right.
You're right. You're okay. Objectively right. It's in Luke 19, and he says, "For this prophecy must be fulfilled in me. He was numbered with the transgressors." Then they said, "Look, Lord, here are 2 swords," and then Jesus says, "That's enough." So when he said, get swords, he says, you have to get swords so that I will be numbered with the transgressors.
Okay.
He was quoting Isaiah 53. And so you do realize that prior to the arrest in the garden, the officials went to arrest him before, but all he was doing was preaching, so they left him alone. This is in John chapter 7. They came back empty-handed, and then they said, where is he? And their response was, he was just preaching.
Okay, where's the objectively good message that's going to change humanity?
So he talked about nonviolence, and he exemplified nonviolence up to the point of death. I think you and I both agree that nonviolence is the way to go. I think Jesus is probably a little bit more radical about nonviolence than you are, because it seems that you have like an extreme case where violence is necessary type of ideology. Jesus took it to the extreme and said, don't do it for any reason, even if they kill you.
Okay.
And on top of that, he preached many sermons on forgiveness, which even from your perspective, forgiveness is a way for a better society. For example.
And yet, at the same time, there's the whole belief thing where you can't be forgiven if you blaspheme the Holy Ghost. If you say, I don't believe there's a Holy Ghost, you're done. That's the unforgivable sin.
No, that's not the context of the passage. The context of the passage was religious people who were constantly denying the truth that they saw, the objective truth that they saw. What's interesting to me is that Jesus attracted the outcast, the marginalized, and the poor, as well as early Roman soldiers. And
okay, so the point is on the belief thing. You still can't get into heaven if you don't believe there's a heaven. You have to believe it, and do as Jesus said. You can have the answer to any prayer as long as you believe you already have it answered before you pray it. And then, yeah. So I mean, there's still this whole belief thing. So I mean, there's not, and you have to believe for no reason. So it's got to be a faith thing. So you have to convince yourself that if you tell that mountain to jump into the sea, that mountain will jump into the sea. But you just have to really, really believe hard enough, pretend with all your might, and then that'll happen. So there's not an objectively positive message there. I mean, he's repeating Buddha 600 years later, but I mean, that apart from that, what else?
Well, he doesn't say belief in spite of evidence. As a matter of fact, he said the opposite. John chapter 10.
He said he will never put God to the test, and that you must have faith. And if you had even the faith of a mustard seed, that this would do.
Hold on. Not putting God to the test was in response to the Satan character trying to get him to jump off of the high point of the temple to make himself famous. That had nothing to do with people wrestling with doubts. Jesus, when he was faced with the doubts of people, said, if you don't believe the words that I say, believe in the actions that you see. That's John chapter 10.
Okay.
He never told anybody to believe for no reason. So
well, he certainly didn't give any kind of reasons to believe. There was no test of evaluation. He didn't explain anything about rationalism or scientific methodology. There was just believe what I said because I said so, or else.
Okay, where does he say that? Like, what's your reference point for when he said that? Believe what I say for no reason or else.
When does he give you the explanation of rationalism or scientific methodology? When does he say, don't believe anything until we can test it, and then to believe only tentatively even then?
Well, hold on. You made a positive claim. You claimed that Jesus said, believe what I say for no reason other than I said it or else.
Yeah, you have to. And he said it many different ways at many different times. And one of the ways that he phrased that was when he said that if you don't confess to me, then I won't confess you to the Father, for example, is one of many different instances. He's paraphrased again and again. Never was there any description of you should not believe unless for good reason, and then only tentatively even then. No, it was all about belief.
Well, no.
Belief is the only way into heaven. Belief is and yes, it is on faith. It's always required on faith.
Well, we're going to talk about faith in a second, but so he never said believe for no reason. What he said was, if you deny me before men, I will deny you before my Father and the angels.
Right. So that can be paraphrased as the very sentiment that I'm talking about. Believe me because I said so. You're not giving a reason. He's giving a threat. That when you die, then which the thing will never happen. Well, then I get to hold this threat over you in the afterlife.
Well, no, that's a relational phrase. If I were to say to you, "Hey, look, man, I grew up in the hood. I grew up in the ghetto, and so when you were friends with somebody, it meant that they were going to stay with you till the end. So if you had a friend that was only your friend when everything was cool, but then when the dudes were coming after you, they weren't your friend, you'd say, all right, well, then we're not friends.
Okay.
So when Jesus says, if you deny me before men, what he's saying is, look, I'm willing to die for you. And what I'm demanding is that you follow my example, that you be willing to die for me. Now, you can say that you don't like that ideology, but you can't say that that's the same thing as just blind belief. That's something completely different. These are relational. These are the terms of a relationship.
Okay, so where did Jesus describe anything other than faith? Where did he instead say, no, all the stuff I said about mustard seeds and all that, forget that. Let me talk about rationalism for a minute. When do we get that?
I just gave it to you. John chapter 10, he says, if you don't believe what I'm saying, believe in the works that I am doing.
Right, don't argue my side, argue your side.
I just told you.
Yeah, you just gave me the proof of what I was saying, so now show evidence for your position. Where did he argue for rationalism instead?
Okay, maybe I'm not communicating it right. What he said was, if you don't believe what I am saying.
Okay, where does he show where you can test the belief objectively?
Because he was doing miracles. And by the way,
where can you test that objectively?
Hold on for a second. The people in the context of the passage didn't deny that he was doing miracles.
I understand that. And people always want to bring up, oh, well, there was doubting Thomas and he needed evidence and Jesus showed him evidence. Yeah, I know. Jesus said, you believe because you had evidence, but blessed is he who has not seen and yet believe. Because there again, as always, paraphrased many different ways, believe the horse shit I'm selling for no damn reason, just because I said so. Where's the positive message?
Well, no. Well, I don't know how else to say this to you. If I were to say, if you were to say, Donald, you're not the president, and if he says to you, well, if you're not going to believe my word for it, here's a presidential seal. I don't know what else to tell you. So the context.
Where do we get a presidential seal? Where do we show me? Where does he say how you can test it objectively? Where you don't have to just take the word of the story.
By the fact that he was doing things that nobody else could do.
So you have to believe the story and accept the story. You can't test the story. You just have to believe the story.
Well, now you're asking two different questions.
Same question. Where does Jesus say that you can test this to show that it's true?
I'm giving you the answer. But just
okay, we may have to move on.
Yep, I'll say something, you say something, then we'll move on to your epistemology. In the narrative, Jesus is doing miracles before the eyes of his audience. And he doesn't say, just believe me because I say it. He says, okay, if you're not going to believe what I say, look what I just did. That's something testable. That guy was born blind. Now he can see. And they actually had a trial. John chapter 9. They actually had a trial where they brought the guy, brought his parents, had witnesses. He was blind when he was born. Now he can see after an interaction with Christ.
Yeah, so, I saw that at one of Peter Popoff's performances. He did the same thing. So it's exactly the same shtick.
No,
you wheel out the guy in the wheelchair, and you get him to stand up, and you pay him his thing, and then you have the people attest. And it's just like when that town in Mexico where everybody in the town saw the Madonna appear in the sky, and there's hundreds of witnesses, nobody named, no one you can ask. You're just supposed to be gullible enough to swallow the story because you saw it in the weekly world news.
Bartimaeus. The guy's named. His name is Bartimaeus. He was blind.
Okay, I get that the Peter Popoff brings the guy on stage, and his name is Bartimaeus, right. and he pays him his $5 under the hand, and then he can go walk again. But the thing was, the guy was never crippled to begin with.
All right, I think that you should probably rephrase those statements, because anybody with a general understanding of the New Testament would challenge you to bring forth a statement where he just says believe and don't think.
I did just give 2 examples.
Well, I mean, that's up for the audience.
I don't know how many more examples I need to give. And you say that you countered that twice, but you didn't either time. So
what you made a false statement. You said that Jesus
I didn't make a false statement. I said that Jesus did tell people, blessed is he who is not seen and but believed. There's the proof of what I'm saying is correct. There, I'm right. That's it. That proves my point.
No.
Now, I'm asking you where you can say people who don't believe the story, people who think that the doubting Thomas was made up just to satisfy the idea or to keep the skeptics quiet. Oh, well, he didn't have evidence. They showed him evidence. So you're supposed to be satisfied with that? Well, so how are we supposed to objectively test this? You said it wasn't on faith, that Jesus didn't want you to believe on faith. Well, where did he tell you that you're supposed to believe on some objectively measurable criteria? Well, and why are we supposed to believe in the first place, which was the point we started on?
Can I talk now? Because you asked a couple questions. Why? I'll answer your last question first. Belief is not a cognitive exercise only in a biblical sense. Belief is a relationship. It's a relational exercise. And we say this a lot when we tell people, I believe in you. You're not saying that I've got a bunch of objective presuppositions that when you're saying, if I tell my son, I believe in you, that is a relational phrase. When you talk about,
that's a different connotation though, or a different context.
What I'm trying to
when you say to believe in something, that's different than having a faith-based belief.
Well, what I'm trying to explain to you is we use this language in relationships all the time. So for example, when a man runs off on a woman, we say he's been unfaithful. Mm-hmm. So these are relational terms. And when you see Yahweh speak to people all through the scripture, he uses relational terms like marriage and friendship and fatherhood and sonship, etc. So when you say this belief thing, you're asking questions that the original audience wasn't even asking. These were not Aristotelians. These were not post-Enlightenment folks. These were folks that believed that they had a relationship with God. So their questions were around, how do we have a relationship with God? So belief was their connection with their relationship with God. And so that's why Jesus makes statements like that. And that's why you always have from the beginning to the end of the Old and New Testament, relational language between Yahweh and his people, where Yahweh marries his people, where the end of Revelation, where Jesus is marrying the church, etc. I guess it's up to the audience to decide. What I interpreted from your initial question was, show me a place where Jesus says to take things other than just pure blind faith. And I quoted to you a passage where
I asked specifically where he explains either scientific methodology or rationalism.
Okay.
Either one, which would be the opposite of faith.
Well, okay. Now we're going to have to go to that because that's such an interesting question to me. So you have...
See, what you end up with when you talk about, having faith in someone, then it's equivocation because you're using two different contexts. We have a religious context, which is a secure conviction that is not based on evidence. And then we have something that is no more than trust, right? So we have trust in someone. But religious faith is a kind of trust, but it's got a prefix and a suffix. It's a complete trust that is not based on evidence. So I've
never met a Christian with complete trust in God.
Okay. And I meet Christians all the time who are wholly unreasonable, who tell me that nothing will ever change their mind. And that if I ever say anything that makes sense, it is only the devil speaking through me, for he is the Lord of lies, even though the serpent was the only one who told us truth in the story.
Well, no, I mean, I'm not afraid of truth. I mean, there have been a couple errors, and there have been a couple things that you didn't know. For example, you didn't know about Jewish binitarianism. You didn't know about the two powers in heaven. You didn't know about the angel of the Lord character. You didn't know any of this stuff. So I think we're all growing. We're all learning. But talk to me about your epistemology as regards faith. First of all, say the term, because I never heard the term before.
Okay, well, it's not epistemology. It's epistemivism, which it implies something different. It means that we will not hold any belief based on faith. Faith is the most dishonest position it is possible to have, because it is an assertion of empty speculation as though it were fact. And if you state something that is a fact, if state something as fact that isn't fact, meaning that it's not objectively verifiable, well, then that's already a lie. But that's what all religions do. That's almost all religion is asserting empty, baseless speculation as though it were fact. So and then also the apologetics is the second part of that, which makes it even more dishonest, because apologetics is the systematically making up excuses to rationalize away or dismiss any and all evidence or arguments against that position, no matter what. And if you look up at all the major creationist organizations like ICR or AIG or any of those, they all publicly post statements, declarations, as if this was something to be proud of, or that they will never admit when they're wrong, that they will automatically reject any and all evidence that ever stands against them. And I can cite you exactly verbatim what they all say.
Yeah, put that in the chat. I'm not disputing you. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me.
That's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, they all say that, by definition, no evidence, historical or scientific or whatever, can ever be valid if it contradicts the biblical record or whatever they...
So you are one of the only people I've ever heard, because I actually had this conversation with my biologist friend, and he was on the other side of you on this one. Are you saying that all the convictions that you have you know them all concretely and definitively? Like there's nothing that you believe that has any modicum of faith in it at all?
None.
So when you talk about Hammurabi, for example, are you certain that Hammurabi existed?
It is a consensus that Hammurabi existed, and the Stela of Law does actually exist. It's in the Louvre. And as I said, the Ark of the Covenant exists only in movies.
You've been to the Louvre.
I'm sorry, what?
You've been to the Louvre?
Unfortunately, I showed up on a Tuesday. They're closed on Tuesday. But
are they really?
Yeah, it's sad. It's sad. We were in Paris one damn day. It was a Tuesday. We were there expressly to go to the Louvre.
So how do you know the Stella's in the Louvre?
I will accept a consensus report of all the different people who have been there. People I know have been there and taken pictures of the Stella. And I went to see it myself. And were it not a Tuesday, I'm sure that I would have gotten in to see it.
So you believe that those pictures are authentic?
Yeah, I'm not going to go into full-on conspiracy mode. I don't have to know anything 100%. Nobody knows anything 100%. But okay, I do have high percentages of probability.
Okay, so define. So here's what I took, and I probably misinterpreted this. This is a helpful conversation. So when I heard you say that you don't believe anything on faith, I took that to mean that you have absolute certainty for all of your convictions.
No, of course not.
Okay.
I have absolute certainty for some of them.
Sure.
There was no global flood.
Yeah, but how is that different from anybody? I don't think you'd run into a Christian that says they have absolute certainty on everything.
The one minister that I mentioned to you before that said that if he didn't exist 5 billion years from now, then there's no reason to feed a starving child today, right? That guy. You know what? I sidetracked myself.
We're talking about absolute certainty. Faith.
Absolute certainty, yeah. He admitted to his own congregation that he is delusional, that he does not care what is true. And by extension, no one in his congregation cares what is true. He said that in the sermon.
Who is this guy?
His name is John Christie. He made a movie called My Week in Atheism, and I was one of the atheists interviewed in that film.
All right. I mean...
But I've heard this admission numerous times that they don't care what the truth is. They're going to believe what they want to believe. These may be what the facts are, but I prefer to believe this. Whatever. It's the power of make-believe.
Okay, so define what you consider faith to be.
Faith is an assertion of unreasonable conviction assumed without reason and defended against all reason.
Who define unreasonable? What do you mean by unreasonable?
You can't be reasoned with. You're not going to be reasoned with. You didn't come to this conclusion because you were convinced by evidence. You bought it when it was sold to you. You were raised with it, or you assumed it. I did an interview with Dr. Seigart, who told me that he was an atheist for a long time, and there've been a handful. I actually like to interview people who were, in fact, previously atheists. Most of the time they're lying. But there are some that actually were atheists at one point, and then they adopt this religious position. And I always ask the same question that I would have asked, you understand what the question means, having once been atheist. What was the reason? What was the evidence that convinced you? Never do I get an answer. Not once. Seigart's answer was he just wanted to believe it, and that's it. So he assumed that conclusion.
Yeah, but I mean, don't you think that you have... Let me ask it this way. What constitutes evidence to you of a divine being?
Anything that qualifies as evidence would be a body of facts that are objectively verifiable and positively indicative of that one conclusion over any other, meaning that it is either positively indicative of or exclusively concordant with, so that this fact cannot be true if this other thing is true. So, I mean, it has to either positively promote this idea or it has to stand against the other one.
Okay, so give me an example of what would constitute verifiable evidence to you, for example, that Jesus rose from the dead 2,000 years ago.
Well, first, I can't think of an example for something that fanciful. I was thinking of something more realistic. Like, I mean, I normally argue with people against creationism versus evolution, for example. I mean, one of the evidences, I can't believe I said evidences. I make fun of people for doing that. One of the
I was
examples.
Shocked. I was like, did he just say evidences?
Yeah, I did. Can't believe I did that.
Stable the recording.
Yeah, one of the examples I give, I mean, that okay, here's a fact that would be positively indicative of this conclusion and exclusively concordant with this conclusion, meaning that this fact stands for my position and against the creationist position. One of those facts: we are apes. For example, this is a biological fact of taxonomy and cladistics. And this fact not only promotes the evolutionary position, but it also stands against the creationist position. If we were created, why were we made monkeys? That doesn't make any sense from a creationist perspective. So to give you an idea of what evidence is.
I mean, you have theistic evolutionists. I don't see that's a non sequitur to me.
But theistic evolution isn't creationism. Creationism
you're talking about, okay, I see where you're going. But I mean, the resurrection is the centerpiece of Christianity, right? So
okay.
What would you posit as
it's not
evidence?
The resurrection of Jesus is utterly meaningless to me. There's no value in that.
What I'm saying is,
when I asked you about the objective good, there's no reason for the sacrifice. This was the first problem I had with theology when Christianity was first 5 years old about when Jesus died on the cross. I'm like, why? Well, he had to. Why? He had to sacrifice, God had to sacrifice himself to save us from himself. Why? That doesn't make any sense. Well, that's what we believe. Why? That makes no sense.
It makes a lot of sense to me that
so this guy, he absolves all your sins, but we still have the sins. What the hell did he do?
Because eventually we're going to overcome them. But and I'd love to talk about atonement theory with you. That'd be great. But what I'm asking you for is, I'm not asking what it means to you. What I'm asking you is, what in your perspective of belief and faith and knowledge, what would constitute verifiable evidence that Jesus rose from the dead?
Well, we either have positive evidence or we have falsification. So when you're talking about people, and I've heard them do this, mainstream Christians have made the statement that, they use as evidence that they have an empty tomb, that somehow constitutes evidence that Jesus was ever in it, as if that makes any sense. So you can't have evidence of the non-existence of him in that tomb. The only thing you could have would be falsification, which means it would have to be a Jesus, which I don't think there was. And then you'd have to have some way of identifying that it was a Jesus to falsify it, which nobody would accept.
That's true, though. That is an interesting point. Like,
what?
When people will say, well, the empty tomb is evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. But if you don't believe that Jesus existed, then the empty tomb means nothing.
Yeah.
And you don't even have, it doesn't even matter that you don't have to believe in Jesus. Okay. Let's say that you think there was a Jesus, right? How do you know that was the tomb? That's just another assumption.
Your postulation that Jesus doesn't exist goes against the idea of consensus that you brought out. The vast majority of Second Temple scholars and scholars, even Bart Ehrman himself, scoffs at the idea that Jesus never existed.
Oh, I know, and I've read Ehrman's arguments, and they're dissatisfying to say the least.
So when you talk about Hammurabi and you talk about consensus, you're being inconsistent in your understanding of Jesus. Because
so we're talking about whether you can look up the Louvre. It advertises that if you go to the Louvre, you'll see the Stela of Law, right? Where's our challenge there? They're advertising that it's there. You pay your admission, you will see this. This is a draw to get people to go there. Now, I am to believe that thousands of people are lying about whether they saw that there. I mean, I have to buy into the most ridiculous of all conspiracy theories. But conversely, I have people who were raised Christian, who were taught all their lives there was a Jesus, who never questioned that fact. They just said, well, everybody knows there's a Jesus. All the historians accept there was a Jesus. Of course they do. They were all raised Christian. Of course they accept that there was a Jesus. They were all taught that. But then if you start looking at the reasons why, when you start realizing that the Christians are saying, when it says, James, when Josephus wrote about James, a brother of Jesus, the anointed, well, oh, that's our man. There's your proof right there, except that they were talking about Jesus of Damnius, not Jesus of Nazareth. And then with the other time, when they've got, like, I think it's in Luke, where Josephus is writing about from the perspective of Joseph of Arimathea, right? Joseph Bar Matthias. Right, so now we've got Luke written at the same time. By the way, we've got Luke writing about Joseph of Arimathea, and Joseph of Arimathea, Josephus Bar Matthias, writing about Luke's perspective is from the opposite direction, but they're not talking about the same guy. Josephus, at least, is not talking about Jesus of Nazareth. Josephus is talking about a completely unnamed Jesus who just happened to be associated with two people he knew when he went to go to get Titus to have his friends pulled down, and two of them died, and one lived. That's where that part comes from. And then we've got another reference to Jesus ben Ananias, which is another different Jesus, but the Christians say that's their Jesus too.
Hold on. Well, I never said that. I'm a Christian. Hold on. What I'm saying is your basis for believing that Hammurabi existed and that stela is the authentic stela was that there was consensus. Now, what I'm telling you is you have to admit there is a consensus of any respectable scholar in the field, Christian or otherwise.
I can't say any respectable.
The consensus is
I will give you that the majority of people who were raised Christian and never questioned it, they accept that conclusion still.
Well, Bart Ehrman has questioned a lot about Christianity. So
I know I took my classes on the
that's how he made his
religion. My classes on the history of world religion and comparative religions were based on Bart Ehrman.
Right. So that's how he made that's how he got his that's how he made all his millions. So So all I'm saying is you're inconsistent, because with Hammurabi, you go with the consensus, but with Jesus that you don't.
I said, yeah, I will accept in that case, because the only way to counter that would be to adopt this huge conspiracy theory. I don't have to do that to realize that, okay, why, when I ask the historians, so you accept there's Jesus. Why? And don't think I haven't asked a whole bunch of them to tell me why. And Bart Ehrman himself gave a dissatisfactory answer. He's the only one that attempted something better than, well, every historian accepts that Jesus. Really? Why was the question, right? And so Ehrman, I don't remember what his explanation was either, but it was going for the status quo. It's just like, whatever, we were all raised to accept that there's a Jesus, so there's a Jesus.
Well, no,
I don't think there is. And the biggest problem I have with that is the facts stand against it. See, now if you can't call me contradictory if I accept the consensus that the Stela of Law is in the Louvre. The Louvre is advertising that's the reason that they're bringing people to see it.
Well, they have a
right?
financial stake in that, right?
Yeah, they absolutely do. But
Okay.
that stake would collapse if it wasn't actually there.
Says
So
who?
Says who?
They're the authority on whether or not it's authentic.
There's no authority.
Who's challenging them?
The people who show up to see it. The people who show up to take the pictures of it. Myself, when I show up to see it.
Yeah, but Aaron, you don't. I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing your name properly. You're not an expert in the A&E and Hammurabi and all that. I mean, I think you're an expert in something, but that's not your field, bro.
Okay, so it isn't.
So you're accepting.
What museum do they have the Ark of the Covenant in?
I think the Ark of the Covenant's probably in Ethiopia somewhere.
Okay, so we have quite a few historians who show evidence, not just opinion, not just authority, but actually have evidence of Hammurabi and the Stela of Law. And then we have these same laws. And then we have these same laws later appear in Exodus 20 through 23.
Well, not the same ones. For example,
some of them are the same ones.
I'm the Lord your God. You shall have no.
Yeah, but some of those laws are the same ones.
The 10 Commandments are actually based on.
I'm not talking about the 10. There's 11 commandments just in Exodus 20.
Right.
And then the list continues through Exodus 21, 22, 23. And then Moses brings all the whole list down. And so there are several laws, dozens of them.
You got to let me finish. The suzerain vassal motif is much more close to, and this is an argument for your side, to what Moses was doing than Hammurabi. I don't know if you're familiar with the Suzerain Vassal Treaty. But
I'm not.
Yeah, the structure of what you see, I agree with you, from Exodus and the collection of the laws. And the way that Moses presents the laws out as a narrator is much closer to a Suzerain Vassal Treaty than it is to anything from Hammurabi. As a matter of fact, it fits the pattern almost exactly, where the leader, the one in authority, says, I did this for you. Here are the laws. You must do this for me. Punishments for failure to obey, rewards for. It follows the exact pattern of a Suzerain Vassal Treaty.
And while Jesus' mythicism hasn't quite taken off yet, and I understand that, Moses' mythicism certainly has. So we're now achieving consensus that there was never a Moses.
Well, that's another logical leap that you take that interests me. So if I were to say to you, there's a character who rose up and rebelled against an empire and overthrew them at great cost to himself and against great odds. And then I were to say, that's George Washington. And then another person shows up and says, that character shows up in literature all the time. And I bring you thousands of examples. That doesn't invalidate that George Washington existed, because there are a bunch of examples of the same pattern.
Well, yeah, except that they're not just discrediting Moses. It's not just that his life story is based on other life stories of people that came before him. His miracles were done by other people that lived before him who actually existed. It's not just that. It's that everything attributed to Moses never happened. It's like
you believe they never happened.
Well, we know that the Exodus didn't happen. There was never a time when there were 2 million Hebrews living in one town at a time in Ramses, in a time when the entire population of Egypt was only 3.5 million people. If such a case ever were to happen, you got 2 million people versus what, 10 that are supposed to keep them all in control? There's 600,000 Hebrew men on foot.
Where does Moses explain which dynasty of Egypt they were in?
They don't. and none of them match. There's not a place you can put him. So I said the town of Ramses. I wasn't talking about the rule of the pharaoh Ramses. Ramses in about 1250 BC is where a lot of people want to put him, because that's the most ambiguity. That's the most room or leverage that they think they could fit him into, because he doesn't fit anywhere else. Even worse than he doesn't fit there. But it's still, if you had this town of Ramses, you had 600,000 Hebrew men on foot, and leave the women and children and the elderly and all them, but have them march for Canaan, single file, each man 1 meter ahead of the next. It would take 2 weeks to get there following the coastline, and the first ones would arrive before the last ones left.
I agree with that.
But with God's help, it takes 40 years wandering lost in the desert. You're following a damn coastline.
Well, there's
it's 2 weeks away.
Yeah, some of this stuff is weird to me, man, because any kid in Sunday school could tell you why it took 40 years.
Okay, what would the kid in Sunday school tell me?
Well, there's a very specific reason. They were told to go into the land. They ran into Anunnaki or Nephilim. They were afraid. They didn't go in, and God said, and what they said was, "We're going to die here." And so God said, "Okay, we're gonna walk around in this wilderness until all of you die, and then your kids will go in and they'll take the land." So it was a punishment for stubborn disbelief.
So it's a broken promised land.
Which was no, because they actually, if you read the end of Joshua, Joshua actually says all the good promises that the Lord your God gave to you have been accomplished because the children in the next generation were able to go through.
And then this is also the God with the chosen people who has to drive out the Canaanites and everybody else before they get, well, what are you going to do with the Canaanites? Don't worry, we'll take care of them. We'll get rid of them before you get there.
What's your point? First of
all, I'm talking about this is that there's so much inconsistency. There's not a consistency to this story. I don't know how to explain my position on this. We're talking about a fable. We're talking about a fable that has what?
You jumped all over the place. First, you said that they're following the coastline. Why did it take 40 years? I explained that. And you said, "Oh, well, he didn't."
How do we justify the broken promise to fit in the other stories that didn't belong there, to fit in other stories that didn't belong there, to then rub the eraser on the inconsistency of the whole story to begin with, which was supposed to be their exodus to the promised land, that was supposed to where they clear the Canaanites out, as if God can see everything and he knows the future, so he makes this promise knowing in advance that he's going to break it.
Well,
for what reason?
What promise did he break?
This was the promised land, right? They're going to clear out the Canaanites before they get there, and we're going to march to this place. But no, we're not, because you guys said this other thing. I didn't see that coming, so we're going to change the story. So now you have to kill gazillions of people.
It wasn't gazillions of people. who did he make the promise to?
Well, okay, I realize that gazillions is not an actual number, but I don't know what the actual number of tens of thousands of people that the Hebrews killed in those stories actually totals up to.
Well, actually, if you read in Joshua, it's relatively small, but it's war, and it's not.
It's relatively small, meaning something like the entire population of Egypt?
No, it wasn't the entire population.
Within that 40-year period?
No.
Wasn't it about 3 million people?
Where are you getting the entire population was killed?
Well, you add up the tens of thousands of this group and the tens of thousands of this other tribe, and then all of the Midianites and all the Canaanites and everybody else, the Moabites and everybody else that was killed in this brutal slaughtering,
Aron,
comes up to about 3 million, right?
Aron, the Hebrews never, I repeat, never, and this is explicit in the scripture, killed everybody in the land.
Nor did I say that. Although it was prophesied, and it's one of the prophecies that failed, they were supposed to do that, where Nebuchadnezzar was supposed to kill everybody in Egypt, and Egypt was supposed to be completely abandoned for 40 years. And that's another one of many prophecies that never happened. But that's not what I said. I said that the Hebrews went around this, for 40 years, killing all these other people. Tens of thousands of this group, tens of thousands of this group.
That's okay. Let's do this. Give me your reference for when they did that. What passage are you citing?
Which one do we need? I mean, how many different are you admitting that they went 40 years killing a bunch of different people?
No, they went for 40 years around and around the wilderness.
Killing a bunch of people?
No,
they didn't kill a bunch of people.
The purpose of them going in around for 40 years.
So they didn't, the Midianites never got raised, never got burned to the ground.
You gotta let me answer a question. If you're talking about the wilderness wanderings, that was not in the context of conquest. They were wandering around in
So during that 40-year period, they weren't killing people?
Sargon attacked them. Deuteronomy talks about this clearly. Sargon
And
attacked them.
then all these promises that God is going to deliver these people into your hands.
Well, remember the Suzerain Vassal Treaty in Deuteronomy 27. God said, "If you guys are obedient, this will happen." In Deuteronomy 28, he said, "If you're disobedient, this will happen. They will chase you out of town." And if you read the book of Judges, you will see that's exactly what happened. So
I said they went through the desert. They were wandering nomads. They were killing tens of thousands of people.
No, they weren't. I completely deny that. And I'm asking you to show me documentation of what you're talking about. Because I'll gladly change my position.
All right, Exodus 31.
Say again?
Exodus 31.
Okay, what happened in Exodus 31?
No, is it Numbers 31? I might have to look it up.
Well, I got Bible software here. Who are the subjects?
Midianites.
Okay. Are you saying the Midianites were completely cleansed from the land?
Did I ever imply that anyone was completely cleansed from the land?
Okay, so Midianites in what now? Exodus 31?
Yeah, they killed all I said in each of the groups that I mentioned. The Moabites and what was the other one where they said they were going to wipe all memory of this group. I can't remember the name. I'm having a senior moment where I can't remember all the names I want. But it was that foolish thing where they said, write it down and remember that we're going to blot this name out for all of history, which makes absolutely no sense again.
Right.
Why would you write it down to remember what you're going to forget?
Right. Because and you take the position that the Torah was written in Babylon, right?
No.
Where do you think the Torah was written?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by Torah. What most people are talking about is the Tanakh, or you might be talking about the Pentateuch. I don't know. If you talk about the
Tanakh is the Torah, the Ketuvim, and the Nevi'im. It's the combination of all those. The Torah is the first 5 books.
Okay, so the Torah. Okay, all right. So the written Torah, essentially, is the Pentateuch in your perspective, right?
I mean, that's
okay.
That's how it's been historically defined.
Okay. All right. I just want to make sure because I hear people give it differently. Like the Torah has been described as the entirety of the Old Testament. So
nope. The Tanakh is sort of a combination. It's the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, TNK, Tanakh. But the Torah specifically is the 5 books.
Yeah, I'm just saying that Christians have told this to me different ways how they interpret it. So I'm just clarifying with you.
No, I'm with you.
All right. So what was the question?
So we're talking about killing a bunch of people.
Amalek, the Amalekites. We're going to write down and remember the name of the Amalekites because we're going to blot out Amalek from history. So write it down and remember that this is the guy we're going to forget.
Yeah. We're going to, I think it was actually did a podcast on this. Like, we're going to blot their name out from under heaven. I don't know the exact verse, but that is there. And that was there was a list of 7 nations that were supposed to be cleansed from the land because the Israelites were to be God's sort of judgment, provided that they were a righteous nation. If they weren't a righteous nation, then God would send the Babylonians and the other folks to judge them. And so what you have is when they get into the promised land, they initiate the campaign. But what you notice is very quickly after that, and Deuteronomy 31 prophesies this, that the people turn away from God, so they never got complete victory. And what happens is they start to syncretize with the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites, and all these other people. So they were commanded to be God's sword of judgment, but they were never able to fulfill it because they were sinners themselves, which is the point of the Torah. That's the point. The point is everybody deserves to die because they've sinned against Yahweh, including the chosen people.
And you were talking to me about nihilism at the beginning of this.
No, but the message of the Torah is that nobody can fulfill the law. That's why you have the hero character like Moses, right? Who can't even get into the promised land because of his sin. So the Torah does something really interesting where it sets up a hero and then it destroys him, which is very different from all the other literature in the A&E. So Moses is set up as this hero, but he can't even get into the promised land because Yahweh's angry at him. And so there is an underarching message of the Torah is that nobody is righteous, and aside from the grace of Yahweh, nobody would survive.
Okay.
Okay, so all of what you're talking about is you're missing.
We made reference to the Midianites, and you asked me if the Torah was written in Babylon. As my understanding, it was that most of the Pentateuch was supposed to have come, or at least Genesis was supposed to have come out from Ezra around 450 BC. So I'm going to go ahead and subscribe to the hypothesis of the Yahwists and the Deuteronomists and so forth. Yeah, and the priestly writers and so forth.
The priestly writers. So the Yahwist is in one, and then the priest is in two. Yeah, I actually subscribe to the Ezra is more of an editorial. So Ezra made editorial edits. For example, you see this clearly in the end of Deuteronomy, where it says they married Moses and they mourned for him for 40 days. And then since the death of Moses, there hasn't been a prophet like him who knew God face to face. I think it's the last verse in Deuteronomy, right? And so obviously Moses did not write that part. And so there's a theory that I subscribe to. John Sailhamer is my major influence for me.
It says that Moses saw God face to face.
Mm-hmm. It's in,
as obviously Jacob saw him face to face too, and so did Adam.
Well,
and then
it's
what was it? 72 other people on another occasion. Yet God says that he has to turn his face from Moses because no man can see me and live.
Well, this is, remember we were talking earlier about the two powers in heaven? These stories are where that came from.
Okay.
The man that, who is Jacob wrestling? Jacob is obviously wrestling with God, right? But he somehow lives. The same thing happens with Samson.
Although I have talked to Christians who tell me that Jacob is not wrestling God, that Jacob is wrestling some anonymous angel acting as God.
Well, this is what I'm talking about. The Malach Yahweh, the angel of Yahweh, the messenger of Yahweh, is himself a divine figure who is actually called Yahweh in the scripture. So in one verse, he's called the messenger of Yahweh, and then the very next verse, he's called Yahweh himself. You can see this clearly in Judges chapter 6. You can see it in Exodus chapter 3. So yeah, I mean, I'm agreeing with you. But the thing about Moses was that, but the reason I brought up the Moses face-to-face thing was because there's an obvious editorial edit at the end of Deuteronomy because Moses did not chronicle his own death, right? And he doesn't chronicle how people were mourning. And you'll notice it says, since the days of Moses, there's never been a man like him who knew God face-to-face, which is an allusion to Deuteronomy 18. So my point is I agree with you that as far as Ezra, because during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, you had an explosion of scholarship during that period. And so they went back and did the edits, and that's where you see these clear editorial markers in the.
Yeah, that's something I find curious, that you look back to the time of Isaiah, coincidentally is also the time of Zarathustra, coincidentally is also the time of Siddhartha Gautama. I mean, and the Ionian Greeks with the emergence of the scientific method. I mean, all of these things were 600 BC.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that all these major religions crop up all at the same time, and the non-religious perspective arises at the same time.
Well, I mean, Judaism or Yahwism at that, because you really couldn't call it Judaism because the tribes were not completely dispersed yet, but they were definitely in decline at the time of Isaiah. And so that's why at the end of the book, you have from, 42 on down, you have this promise of a better age and the restoration of the temple, and God's going to establish the city with rubies instead of pavement and all this, because they were in decline. Because what was happening is when they got exiled, instead of learning their lesson and saying, shit, we shouldn't have done this, they just began to syncretize with the Babylonians or the Persians or whoever.
Yeah. Now, I have to do my own interpretations of things. I mean, rather than always accepting whatever the experts say. If they can give reason why they have this position, then I'll accept it. But on my own interpretation, for example, I'm giving you the truth of the Tower of Babel story. There was a time when Sumerians had organized schools. They had classrooms full of people teaching them how to read and write in cuneiform. And they had all of the ancient stories that they've had since, Ziusudra on down, right? They've had all and Gilgamesh and all of these, the whole of Ashurbanipal's library, right? And so these students are learning this. But then when the fall of the Mesopotamian Empire, they stopped the schools. And within a generation, nobody could read and write cuneiform anymore. So although it's cast in stone, it's unintelligible, and nobody can make sense of it. And this is where I see a parable of the Tower of Babel, because it's exactly that. It was even that exact location. It was the Tower of Marduk was the Marduk ziggurat was the Tower of Babel, literally. And so a generation or two later, nobody can read those stories. They become word of mouth traditions for about 1,000 years until there's written language again. And that's why these stories have morphed, why they have evolved, and integrated other elements into them to become the stories we're familiar with now.
No, I mean, that makes a ton of sense. To me, though, that doesn't militate against the narrative at all. Jordan Peterson said, and people mistake him for a Christian. I don't even know if he's a theist. He won't even answer that question definitively. He seems to be like, it's more of like theistic utility. Like he feels like you can't really have a, he talked about Voltaire and killing God, but he talked about Voltaire in context, because Voltaire wasn't saying, we killed God. I mean, if you've read the whole story of the madman and all the rest of it, Voltaire really took it seriously, this idea that we killed God, and he was worried about the implications. But anyway, when Jordan Peterson says things like, I don't know about these stories, but something had to have happened, right? Where because he talks about how close to the human experiences in the simplicity of these stories that they are. Okay, so I think I asked all my questions from my audience. Man, you've been super generous with your time, man. It's been
a good conversation. It went better than I thought it would.
It did. Cool. Yeah. Let me ask you one more question, and it's I'm being serious. I know you're a pretty sardonic guy and all that, but let's say that you died and you met God, right? And he said to you, well, Mr. Ra, here I am. What would you say to him, really?
Hare Krishna.
Well, I've got the Bhagavad right there, and we've got a Bhakti yoga guy that gives us all the knowledge about.
I have to say I'm impressed with your scholarship. I am. I mean, you actually you recognize the reference that it was the Bhagavad Gita, first of all, and that you actually uttered the word bhakti. I was surprised at the early part of the conversation that you knew what a hadith was.
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't really like talking about stuff unless I've done some ancillary.
Yeah, well, I'm the same way. I don't. If I haven't read on it myself, if I don't have any knowledge of it myself, all I can do is defer to what the experts say. Well, if I've learned enough to form my own opinion that deviates from that, then okay, then I'll talk.
I don't know how much of it you've read, but that discussion with Arjuna is actually pretty compelling, interesting.
It was a disappointing thing. I tell you it was. When I was 16, I was leaning toward the Hindu concept. I liked the idea of cyclic existence, of reincarnation, in a sense. I liked blending Hinduism with Buddhism, perhaps, because I thought that all life, the only religious thing that ever made sense to me was when Obi-Wan Kenobi said that the Force was an energy field created by all living things that surrounds us and penetrates us and binds the galaxy together. And in the book, he went further and said, you can control it to a point, but it also controls you, like controlling the waves in an ocean. And I thought that was a beautiful analogy, so that we living beings are clay figurines, which are malleable because we have water in them, so you can shape them, right? And it becomes a fluid thing. But then when it dries out, it dies. Well, then the water evaporates back into the hydrosphere, and the rest goes dust to dust, so to speak. So I was thinking of our life force as becoming one with the universe, right? We go back into the biosphere. And so when I heard the thing with Obi-Wan, I was like, that makes sense, because that's so much better than the idea of being trapped in an eternal abyss with God for gazillion years and just forever. And the little Anthony Fremont in the Twilight Zone episode of The Good Life, that's what I imagine heaven to be. You've got this telepath who has indomitable powers, and he's an inescapable monster, and you better be thinking nice thoughts.
The kid. Have you ever seen that episode?
Yeah.
I gotta watch that episode with you.
Yeah, that's my favorite episode, and it made a
That's
statement
actually
about.
the scariest episode, period, of any like half-hour show I've ever watched in my life. That terrorized me for a while, and I was a pretty hard kid to scare.
That's impressive.
And he was. I don't want to spoil it for you.
Yeah, don't spoil it.
Yeah, well, I was leaning toward the Hindu concept. I mean, I read Swami Prabhupada. You know, I read The Science of Self-Realization and all like this. But when I got into the Bhagavad Gita, I honestly thought at the beginning, you first hear about Arjuna and you hear about his moral convictions, and I'm like, I'm loving this guy.
He doesn't want to kill all those people.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter that they are my family. You know, I'm going to lay down my arms. I ain't doing this. This is wrong. And Krishna comes and fucks it up and taught him the most immoral mess. Dude, you're supposed to be the God. You're supposed to be the moral one. Why the fuck are you teaching this? So I would.
Yeah, well, it was funny because when my friend was explaining it to me, I mean, he takes his bhakti as serious as I take my, my Christianity, and he's in the robe and all that, and he's got he's all there. So he's explaining it to me when he's giving me a copy of the Bhagavad, and it was a really eerie moment, and I thought to myself, this must be what people, when evangelicals talk about Revelation and Jesus coming and like murder everybody, and you better get wrong, and happy about it. Or like when 9/11 happened, there was a lot of celebrations among evangelicals because they thought that was the cue for the rapture, because we're so freaking ethnocentric that if something happens to America, that must mean the end of the world. Anyway, so when he was talking to me about this conversation with Arjuna and how Arjuna didn't want to fight and all this, and then he said, I hooked up with him later, and I'm like, bro, I think Krishna, like, am I reading this right? Like, is Krishna saying like, fuck them all, kill them? And then
because you're not killing their soul, you're just killing the body they're in right now.
Right. And you're helping them because they're, we think that we're attached to our body. We're really not. But it was this weird moment because he was talking to his girl, and then he looked at me and he smiled and he says, yes. And he enjoys doing this to the wicked or whatever. And I was like, ah. But it was weird because, like, if it's a crazy evangelical, he's about to say some evil shit. You know what I mean? Like, that they say really terrible stuff. But I was unprepared because this guy's like a vegan and he's very skinny and he's a very nice guy. And he turned around and he wouldn't hurt a fly. Remember there was that fly in the.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think I need to say this necessarily to you, but anybody who's listening, the Bhakti are atypical of Hindus.
Right.
So, I mean, I've heard from Bhakti who explained that they are just as hardcore as the evangelical Christians, that they are actual full-on creationists, and they have all the same kind of apologetics in their arguments, for Vedic scripture and everything.
For sure.
But most Hindus are not like that.
No, and he was, we sat down and had some really, really cool discussions.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for having a very pleasant conversation, much better than I thought it would be. It also went a lot longer than I thought it would be, but that's okay.
Yeah. I mean, there are a couple people that really, oh my God, Aron Ra. I was like, who is this guy? And I was looking around like, she was like, are you nervous? I'm like, no, I'm fine. Hey, one thing real quick. This was actually the original point of the discussion, the whole state atheism thing and communism and all that stuff. What's your take on that? My take on that is that was a violent strain of atheism in the history of the world. And it's not as simple as saying atheism was the sole cause, but it was definitely there. What's your take on that?
I'm more inclined to blame it on the 20th century because there was so much of that going on in the first half in particular of the 20th century, that it's just like when we were talking about 2,600 years ago, you had like the independent emergence of all these different religions at the same time. They're not connected to each other. Why do they all emerge at the same time? And I don't know what the mystery of that is, but the problem I have with accepting an involvement of atheism as a cause for the atrocity is, one, it's not logically possible to do anything in the name of atheism. What I do I advocate for truth, for the value of honesty, for human values, for skepticism, for rationalism, but nothing is in the name of atheism. Atheism is just a position I get to by these other means.
Are you familiar with Emilian Yarlovsky?
I'm sorry?
Emilian Yarlovsky.
Not familiar with it.
Okay, he was the head of the League of the Militant Godless. And he defended, his job, he was tasked with basically not de-Christianizing, but de-religizing the USSR. And they got violent. Now their particular group didn't do the killing. They pointed the KGB toward the people that needed the killing. So they were sort of the propaganda / informant arm of the revolution. But he explicitly stated that militant atheism was what was underpinning communism, at least in the USSR, that made it successful. So
again, that doesn't make any sense, because there's not an end goal, there's not a drive for atheism. When you have a religious belief, you have the threat, you better believe this or you're going to hell. This is true in Islam as well as...
We've talked for 2 hours. I haven't threatened you.
But it's not you doing it. It's funny. I gave this presentation on the lack of value of faith, and it was given. I didn't realize that the people in the audience were not people that were familiar with me at all. They were there as college credit, and so they just showed up at random to get credit for having listened to a speech, and so it was all Christian audience, and I was not polite in that speech at all. And at the end, there was these 2 black girls that right from the front row were very indignant with me. And they said, they have atheist friends and it's okay with them if they don't believe. I'm like, well, that's very good of you. I wish your God had that same opinion. God gets really uppity when you don't believe in him.
Well, like I said, everything is relational to me. So I look at it like you said, to you, being with God in heaven would be being consigned to the abyss. So if God says, all right, cool, Mr. Ra, there's your section of the universe, without me, have at it.
Why can't, this was a prayer I honestly asked as a child. I said, I asked of God when I still believed there was one. I said, why can't I just die like I'm supposed to, like everything else is supposed to? Why can't I just live my life and it be it?
Why can't you cease? You mean, when you say die, you mean cease?
Like just that's it. You're dead and you're dead. You don't go anywhere. Even the Bible says you don't go anywhere. You just you go to Sheol, which is what? Nothing. So you go to nothing. So yeah, that's it.
Well, I think my answer would be because you're created in God's image and he can't throw away one of his images. So
I'm sorry, that's not an answer.
Yeah, ask the question. Hell is simply existence outside of the grace of God, and I don't think anybody knows what that really. I don't think that people who make those types of statements understand the implications of what they're saying.
Well, nobody understands what they believe in, but can't show that they actually know, because you can't even honestly say you understand if you can't show that anything you say is even true. I hear all the time people give me all these additional details about the chocolate and sprinkles that are on their God, but if they can't verify that there is a God, how can they add all the details?
Well, I actually don't necessarily disagree with you. Like, for example, the concept of love. Before we got on, I was listening to Sam Harris talk about love, and he basically said something to the effect of, "I know it exists, but we can't quantify it." And I think that's probably true.
I would have had a different opinion. You can verify the existence of God through of love through chemical signatures. Yeah. There's different types of love. There's different categories of love, and different ones have a different chemical element to them. Right? So it's not like a mystical thing.
Yeah. Well, if we were able, and I'm sure we're going to be able to do this scientifically, to trigger those chemical reactions in the brain, that's still not the same thing as a man loving his baby. So you just reduce love to chemicals. I think there's something deeper than that there, which is why.
Did I reduce? We know that it is that. People want to say that, well, you just want to say that we're just chemicals. I'm not saying we're just chemicals, but you certainly can't say that we're not chemicals. We're definitely chemicals.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
So. I agree with that. I'm not a ascetic. I don't believe in this, like everything is spiritual. I think that there's a physical counterpart because we're in the physical universe. I do believe that those chemicals are byproducts of love, but I also think there's something deeper there.
Well, there's circumstance that causes these, and we know what a lot of what those circumstances are. We know a lot of the the pure anthropological cues of you having the oversized eyes and the diminished jaw, the infantilization of the I can't kill that. It looks like me. I must take care of it.
Hopefully.
Aberrations occur, but
well. Mr. Raw, man, I appreciate you, man. We are going to be doing like a public tour, circular tour thing around the world eventually. So hopefully we'll cross paths. That should be an interesting one.
Okay, looking forward to it.
I am actually. I think it would be something that's probably never been done before.
Yeah, I'm excited. I just got an invitation a couple of days ago to go to a church, and somebody's telling me recently that it's a mega church, that it's not the little building that I thought it was. Apparently it's one of those as its own airport. I don't know, but I'm going to this church in Chandler, Arizona. They wanted me there for kind of a debate at first, but what they actually want me to now, they want me to teach a 1-hour class on the basics of evolution and the facts to prove the theory, and this is a creationist church. And I'm like, that's outstanding.
Yeah,
I am so looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's a crazy world we're in right now, man. It really is. All right, brother, I'll let you have the last word.
I don't need it. I'll give it to you.
Well, it was awesome getting to connect with you, man. I really, really appreciate it. Hopefully we'll be doing some work in the future for sure.
Thank you much.
Vin out.
Sori out.
I'm gone.